Ethan Cole had everything money could buy: the corner office, the penthouse overlooking the city, the luxury cars waiting downstairs. And yet, behind the polished smile on magazine covers, he carried a silence so heavy it threatened to crush him. One rainy afternoon, a simple errand, something as ordinary as buying office supplies, brought him face to face with Clara Bennett, a sharp-tongued secretary who didn't flinch at his reputation. She didn't swoon, she didn't beg for attention. Instead, she laughed at him. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt seen not as the billionaire, not as the headline, but as a man. But can a love that begins in the most unexpected corner survive the harsh spotlight of wealth and scrutiny? Can a woman who built her life on resilience ever trust a man whose world once revolved around appearances? And how far would Ethan go to prove that true love isn't about power, but about presence? This isn't just a love story. It's a journey of two people daring to believe that the simplest detours can lead to the biggest destinations. If this story stirs your curiosity, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin. Ethan Cole stood at the corner of a narrow street in a quiet Boston suburb, staring at the small office supply store as if it were a foreign country. The sign above the entrance, Bennett's Stationery and Copy, looked ordinary enough. A few faded posters clung to the glass windows, advertising discounted printer ink and buy one get one notebooks. People went in and out without hesitation, pushing the door open with the casualness of those who belonged there. Ethan, however, did not belong there. At 35, he had built a reputation in business circles as a visionary. His company, Cole Innovations, had expanded from software to energy solutions, and his face had appeared more than once on the covers of glossy magazines. At charity galas, his name drew attention like a magnet. At private clubs, his opinion carried weight. His days were carefully orchestrated by assistants, consultants, and an army of staff who made sure that Ethan never had to handle anything mundane. Until today, his executive assistant, Rachel, had fallen sick. The backup, Thomas, was in Chicago for a conference. And somehow, in the chaos of board meetings and investment calls, no one had noticed that the office printer had run out of toner. At least, not until Ethan himself had needed to print a confidential contract that couldn't wait. For the first time in years, he found himself doing something he hadn't done since college, running an errand. He sighed, adjusted his tailored navy jacket, and stepped toward the door. The bell jingled softly when he entered. Inside, the store smelled faintly of paper and ink, a scent that carried memories of another life, a time when Ethan had been just a student rushing to finish essays before midnight. The aisles were narrow, filled with binders, pens, reams of paper stacked in neat towers. The hum of a copy machine buzzed somewhere in the back. A mother with two children passed by him, one child tugging on her sleeve, begging for colorful markers. Ethan stepped aside awkwardly, nearly bumping into a display of staplers. He muttered an apology, though the woman barely noticed. She was too busy comparing prices. For a man who negotiated billion-dollar contracts with calm authority, Ethan felt strangely out of his depth here. His Italian leather shoes clicked too loudly on the linoleum floor. His cufflinks gleamed too brightly under the fluorescent lights. He searched the shelves with narrowed eyes, hunting for toner cartridges. But every aisle seemed to blend into the next. Binders, sticky notes, greeting cards, craft supplies. Where in the world did they hide the basics? After 10 minutes, he still hadn't found what he needed. He checked his watch. Time was slipping away minutes he would normally spend finalizing deals or reviewing proposals. The idea of being late because of a printer cartridge felt almost insulting. Then he heard a voice, looking a little lost there. "Sir, you okay?" Ethan turned. Behind the counter stood a young woman, probably late 20s, with chestnut brown hair tied back loosely, a pencil tucked behind her ear. She wore a simple blouse, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and her name tag read Clara Bennett. Her hazel eyes studied him with a mix of curiosity and amusement. "I'm fine," Ethan replied, clearing his throat. Just looking for toner? HP? Black cartridge? Clara tilted her head, suppressing a smile. That's aisle 3, halfway down on your right. You walked past it twice. Heat crept up Ethan's neck. He was rarely embarrassed, but something about her tone, a gentle tease, not unkind, made him feel oddly exposed. Thank you, he said curtly, adjusting his jacket again as though the gesture might restore some dignity. No problem, Clara replied. It happens. These aisles are trickier than Wall Street. The words caught him off guard. Did she recognize him, or was it just a coincidence? Ethan wasn't sure. He found the toner easily this time, grabbed 2 cartridges, and returned to the counter. Clara was waiting, leaning slightly against the register, tapping a pen absent-mindedly. Just these, she asked, scanning the boxes. Yes, Ethan said. Her fingers moved quickly on the register, practiced and efficient. Then she glanced up again, a mischievous glint in her eyes. You don't look like the kind of guy who usually shops for printer toner. Ethan arched an eyebrow. And what kind of guy do I look like? The kind whose assistant does this sort of thing, Clara said lightly. Am I wrong for a moment? Ethan had no reply. He wasn't used to strangers cutting straight through the layers of formality that usually shielded him. Most people deferred, flattered, or tried to impress him. Clara did none of those things. He found himself smiling, a rare, unguarded smile. You're not wrong. Thought so, she said, handing him the bag. But hey, everyone's human. Even millionaires need ink sometimes. The casual mention of his status made him pause. She did know who he was, yet her tone carried no awe, no fear, no calculated flattery, just matter of fact, with a sprinkle of humor. Ethan took the bag slowly. Their fingers brushed for the briefest second. He felt a strange flicker, an energy he couldn't name. Well, he said, almost reluctant to leave, thank you for your help. Anytime, Clara replied. Though next time, maybe make a shopping list. Saves you from wandering in circles. The bell above the door jingled again as Ethan stepped back into the cool afternoon air. He walked toward his parked car, the bag in hand, and paused. For reasons he couldn't explain, he lingered by the curb, staring at the store sign again. He had gone in for toner, and yet he left with something else, a memory of hazel eyes, a teasing voice, and the unsettling realization that, for the first time in years, someone had spoken to him without treating him like Ethan Cole, the billionaire. Just Ethan. And that felt different. The next afternoon, Ethan found himself sitting in his office, staring at the toner cartridge he had purchased the day before. It sat on the edge of his mahogany desk, the packaging still unopened, as if mocking him. He could have asked one of his junior staff to install it. He could have had it delivered directly from a supplier. Yet, here it was, a small box that symbolized something he hadn't expected, an interaction that had unsettled him in a way no boardroom ever could. He thought about Clara Bennett, the memory of her teasing smile, the lightness in her voice, the way she seemed completely unimpressed by him. All of it kept circling back, tugging at his attention. For years, conversations with women had been predictable. They either tried to charm him with admiration or approach him cautiously. As if he were untouchable, Clara had done neither. She had looked him straight in the eye and told him he looked lost. And she wasn't wrong. By mid-afternoon, Ethan realized he needed another excuse. Something simple, justifiable, but enough to take him back to that little store. He told himself he wanted a spare set of pens for the office. That sounded reasonable. No one would question it. An hour later, his car pulled up in front of Bennett's stationery again. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The store looked the same, shelves lined with paper products. A faint hum of the copy machine, the comforting smell of ink and glue. This time, Ethan walked with more confidence, at least outwardly. Clara was behind the counter again, flipping through a thick catalog. She glanced up as he approached, recognition sparking in her eyes. Well, she said, closing the catalog with a deliberate thump. Back so soon? Don't tell me you already burned through 2 cartridges in a single day. Ethan chuckled despite himself. Not quite. Thought I'd stock up on pens. You can never have too many, right? Clara tilted her head, studying him. That's debatable. Most people lose them faster than they run out of ink. Unless you're secretly starting a calligraphy club. The dryness in her tone caught him off guard again. He was used to polished small talk, not playful banter. No calligraphy, he replied. At least, not yet. She smiled, a quick flash of warmth before her expression returned to business. All right, pens are aisle 2, on the left. You want the kind that actually work, or the kind you give away at conferences so nobody cares when they dry out. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Do you always interrogate customers this way? Only the ones who look like they don't belong here, Clara said, leaning her elbows on the counter. Which, let's be honest, is you. You're dressed like you just stepped out of a shareholder meeting. He glanced down at his pressed shirt and tailored slacks. She had a point. He looked like a CEO on casual day, which still wasn't very casual. Maybe I like blending in, Ethan offered. Clara laughed, the sound light and unguarded. You're about as blended as a peacock at a pigeon party. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt heat rise in his cheeks, not from embarrassment exactly, but from being disarmed. She wasn't cruel, just refreshingly honest. He returned from aisle 2 with 2 packs of pens, more than he needed. Clara scanned them, her fingers moving quickly across the register. You know, she said conversationally, most people who come in here are teachers, parents, or small business owners. They buy pens in bulk because kids lose them or customers steal them. Though I can't quite figure you out. Ethan considered how to respond. He could tell her the truth that he ran a multi-million-dollar corporation, that his days were scheduled down to the minute. But that truth came with weight, with expectation. For some reason, with Clara, he wanted to set that weight down. Maybe I'm just a man who likes good pens, he said softly. Clara looked at him for a moment longer, as if testing his sincerity. Then she shrugged. Fair enough, but I'm keeping an eye on you. You've got the vibe of someone who doesn't usually buy his own office supplies. That line made him laugh again, a genuine sound that surprised even him. It had been too long since laughter had come this easily. As she bagged his purchase, their eyes met briefly. There was no awe in hers, no calculation, just curiosity, lightly veiled by sarcasm. And for Ethan, that was more intriguing than any admiration he had ever received. Thank you, he said, as she handed him the bag. Anytime, Clara replied. Though if you keep showing up like this, people will think you're secretly writing a novel. Pen after pen, page after page. Maybe I am, Ethan said quietly. She tilted her head again, as if filing that comment away. Well, good luck then. Hope it's a bestseller. Ethan left the store, the bag of pens in hand, but his mind elsewhere. For years, he had perfected the art of controlling outcomes, perceptions, even emotions. But one 10-minute conversation with Clara Bennett had thrown that control into question. She had seen past the polished exterior, and strangely enough, he didn't mind. As he slid into the back seat of his car, he caught himself smiling, not the practice smile for cameras, not the polite one for board members, a real one. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a flicker of curiosity, not about a merger or an acquisition, but about a woman who ran a small stationery store and seemed completely unimpressed by who he was. Something about her lingered, and he realized, with a mix of amusement and unease, that he wanted to see her again. The following week should have been like any other in Ethan Cole's life, meetings stacked back to back, lunches with investors, evenings filled with functions where champagne flowed, but conversations felt hollow. Yet, to his own surprise, Ethan found himself distracted, replaying snippets of his encounters at Bennett's stationery. Clara Bennett. The name surfaced in his thoughts during conference calls, in the quiet moments between handshakes, even late at night when the city lights spread beneath his penthouse windows. He remembered the way she leaned on the counter, arms crossed, eyes full of humor, the way she seemed to see him, not the persona that headlines praised or criticized. It was a rare experience for Ethan, and he couldn't let it go. By Wednesday afternoon, he had crafted another excuse. His office had plenty of pens now, enough to last a year, but he told himself he needed notebooks for an upcoming strategy session. He could have ordered them online with a single click. Still, he found himself back in front of the modest storefront, his reflection caught in the glass. The bell jingled as he entered. Clara was there, perched on a stool behind the counter, typing something into the computer. She looked up, eyebrows arching. "You again," she said, her tone half teasing, half curious. "Don't tell me the pens already gave out on you." Ethan smiled faintly. "No, this time it's notebooks. You can never have too many of those, right?" Clara hopped down from the stool. "Notebooks, aisle 4. But fair warning if you keep this up. I'm going to start a loyalty card just for you." Ethan chuckled, following her directions. He picked out 3 sturdy hardcovers, more expensive than he needed, and carried them back to the counter. Clara rang them up with brisk efficiency, but her eyes lingered on him. "You know," she said, "I've seen people go through midlife crises in a lot of ways. Sports cars, tattoos, taking up skydiving, but office supplies. That's a new one." Her grin softened the jab, but Ethan still felt it land. He placed his card on the counter and replied, "Maybe I just like writing things down." Clara handed him the bag. "Or maybe you like wandering into places you don't usually go." Ethan met her gaze. For a moment, silence stretched between them, comfortable, curious. He left the store, but 2 days later, he was back again. This time he claimed he needed envelopes, then a desk organizer, then a ream of paper just in case. Each visit followed the same pattern: Clara's raised eyebrow, her playful questions, Ethan's awkward but genuine attempts to justify himself. The conversations grew longer, inching past small talk. One Friday, as she bagged his purchase, Clara asked, "So, what do you actually do?" Besides hoard stationery, Ethan hesitated. He could give her the rehearsed line about being the CEO of Coal Innovations, but he remembered how refreshing it had been that she hadn't treated him like a headline. He didn't want to break that spell too quickly. "I run a business," he said simply. "Keeps me busy." Clara studied him for a beat before nodding. "Figures. You've got that polished look, but you don't exactly scream happy-go-lucky." Her candor disarmed him again. Most people smoothed their words around Ethan, careful not to offend. Clara, it seemed, spoke whatever she saw. "What about you?" he asked, genuinely curious. Clara leaned on the counter, shrugging. "This store's been in my family since the 70s. My dad ran it until his health forced him to slow down. Now it's mostly me. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. And honestly, I like it. People come in stressed, hunting for something, and I get to help them walk out with what they need. Small victories." There was pride in her voice, but also resilience. Ethan respected that. "You don't ever think about doing something else?" he asked. Clara tilted her head. "Sure, sometimes I wanted to finish college, maybe teach literature. But life happens. My mom passed when I was 20, and someone had to keep the store running. So, here I am. No regrets, though. I'm not waiting for anyone to rescue me, if that's what you're wondering." Ethan opened his mouth to reply, but stopped. The firmness in her tone made it clear she was independent, grounded. She had carved out her path, even when life hadn't been fair. It struck him, in that moment, how different her world was from his. His life was measured in quarterly earnings and high-profile deals. Hers was measured in steady hours behind a counter, serving neighbors and strangers. Yet, somehow, her life seemed fuller. That realization lingered with him as he drove back into the city. The following week, he returned again, under the pretense of buying markers. Clara smirked when she saw him walk in. "At this point," she said, "I should charge you rent. You spend more time here than half my employees." "Maybe I like the atmosphere," Ethan replied, trying to sound casual. Clara laughed. "Atmosphere. This place smells like glue and dust. Not exactly the Ritz." But Ethan shook his head. "It feels real." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Clara's smile faltered for just a second, curiosity flickering in her eyes. She didn't press, but she looked at him differently after that, as if sensing there was more beneath his calm exterior. That night, Ethan sat in his penthouse, surrounded by the quiet hum of modern appliances, staring at the skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The city glittered, glamorous and cold. His bar was stocked with expensive bottles, his shelves lined with art chosen by decorators. He had everything he was supposed to want, yet he couldn't shake the memory of Clara, sleeves rolled up, teasing him about midlife crises and loyalty cards. She was strong, unpolished, and absolutely unconcerned with the world that defined him. And for the first time in years, Ethan admitted to himself that something was missing. Not another deal, not another gala, but something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. When Ethan finally asked Clara to attend one of his company's events, she almost laughed. "Me, at a corporate gala," she said, her hands still busy stacking reams of paper on a shelf. "Ethan, I wear flats to work and consider a new cardigan a splurge. I'd stick out like a sore thumb." "You wouldn't," he replied gently. "I'd like you there, just as you are." But Clara shook her head, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "You forget. I know what your world looks like. Suits that cost more than my rent. Women who glide instead of walk. Champagne flutes instead of coffee mugs. I'd be out of place." Ethan hesitated, then leaned against the counter. "Maybe, but out of place can be refreshing. You'd be refreshing," against her better judgment. Clara agreed, and so, on a Thursday evening, she found herself standing outside the glass doors of a downtown Boston hotel, clutching a small black clutch like a lifeline. The lobby glittered with chandeliers. Inside, the ballroom glowed with golden light, the murmur of voices mixing with the clink of glasses. Waiters in crisp uniforms floated through the crowd carrying trays of wine. Women in sequined gowns laughed like wind chimes. Men in perfectly cut tuxedos shook hands over practiced jokes. Clara inhaled slowly, adjusting the hem of her borrowed dress. It was navy blue, modest but elegant, loaned by her cousin who insisted she needed something decent for the evening. Her hair, usually tied in a quick ponytail, now fell in loose waves around her shoulders. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled into the wrong scene. Ethan appeared at her side, handsome in a charcoal suit, his presence steadying. "You look beautiful," he said softly. Clara gave him a look, half amused, half anxious. "You don't have to say that. I want to," he replied, offering his arm. She took it, but as they walked deeper into the crowd, she felt the weight of eyes turning toward her. Some were curious, others calculating. A few barely concealed their judgment. Whispers followed, subtle but sharp. "Who's she?" someone murmured behind a champagne glass. "Not the usual type." Secretary Assistant Clara pretended not to hear, but the words settled on her shoulders like stones. At the first group they approached, a woman in a glittering silver dress smiled with thin politeness. "Ethan, darling," she purred, ignoring Clara entirely. "We've missed you at the club." Ethan's arm tightened slightly around Clara's. "This is Clara Bennett," he said firmly. "A friend?" The woman's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she extended a manicured hand. Charmed, Clara shook it politely, but her heart was pounding. She felt every difference between herself and the others in the room, their polished ease, their practiced charm, their effortless claim to belonging. As the evening unfolded, the feeling only deepened. Conversations spun around mergers, art auctions, summer homes on Martha's Vineyard. Clara nodded when spoken to, smiled when expected, but the words slid past her like a foreign language. During one exchange, a man laughed too loudly and leaned closer to Ethan. "And this lovely young woman, what agency is she with modeling?" I presume Clara stiffened, but before she could reply, Ethan said calmly, "She's not a model. She runs her family's business." The man blinked, momentarily thrown off. How quaint. that single word sliced sharper than he likely intended. Clara forced a smile, but inside, heat rose in her chest. She suddenly felt small, diminished, as though her life, her hard work was nothing but a curiosity in this world of excess. She excused herself, slipping toward the edge of the ballroom where tall windows overlooked the city. The glass reflected her image back at her simple dress, plain jewelry, hair already loosening. She looked like a stranger at someone else's party. Ethan found her a few minutes later, his brow furrowed. "Clara? Are you all right?" She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I told you I'd stick out." "You don't," he insisted. "Ethan," she said, turning to face him. "Look around. These people live in a different universe. They look at me like I'm a mistake, like I don't belong next to you." His expression softened, but his voice carried a quiet conviction. "You belong with me, not them." For a heartbeat, silence enveloped them. His eyes held hers, steady and intent, and Clara felt something stir in her chest, something she had been pushing away since the first day he walked into her store. It would have been easy, in that moment, to close the distance. His hand brushed against hers, the air between them charged, fragile. But just as she felt herself leaning toward him, a voice interrupted. "Ethan, there you are." An executive from his company approached, all smiles and handshakes, oblivious to the moment he had shattered. Ethan straightened, his business mask sliding back into place. Clara stepped away, her cheeks warm, her pulse unsteady. The executive launched into a conversation about quarterly projections, utterly blind to the tension that still hung in the air. Ethan answered politely, but his gaze kept flicking toward Clara, who stood just a step too far away now. She crossed her arms, grounding herself. Whatever had nearly happened between them, whatever had almost shifted, was gone for the moment. And yet, she knew, deep down, that something had changed. The question was whether either of them was ready for it. The first headline appeared 2 days after the gala: Ethan Cole and the Mystery Secretary. It was splashed across a glossy magazine cover in the corner of a newsstand that Clara passed on her way to work. Her breath caught when she saw the photo Ethan in his tailored suit, looking every bit the powerful businessman, and herself beside him. Caught mid-laugh, her head tilted slightly toward him. The caption beneath the photo was less flattering. "Is Boston's most eligible bachelor abandoning models for small-town charm?" Clara stared for a moment before hurrying past, heart pounding. But as the days went on, the story spread. By Friday, the internet was buzzing with speculation. Some painted her as a refreshing change, but others were cruel, accusing her of chasing wealth, of being a nobody who had stumbled into a world where she didn't belong. At Bennett's stationery, the teasing began almost immediately. "Look at you, Clara," said Lisa, a part-time cashier barely out of high school, waving her phone. "Front page with Mr. Cole himself. Didn't know you were moonlighting as a socialite." Clara forced a laugh. "Don't believe everything you read." Another coworker chimed in, smirking. "So, when's the wedding? Or are you just testing out the billionaire lifestyle before you cash in?" The comments stung more than Clara wanted to admit. She tried brushing them off, but whispers followed her through the aisles. Customers gave her lingering looks, some curious, some judgmental. Even the delivery driver made a joke about marrying up. By the end of the week, Clara felt raw, her independence suddenly invisible under the shadow of Ethan's wealth. That evening, she closed the register and lingered in the quiet store long after the last customer had left. Her father, who sometimes came by to check on things, found her staring at the headlines on her phone. "Clara," he said gently, "you don't have to read that garbage." She sighed. "I didn't ask for this. Dad, I like talking to him. Now everyone thinks I'm some gold digger." Her father's eyes softened. "People will always talk. What matters is whether you know who you are." Clara nodded, but the words only soothed her for a moment. Deep down, she wondered if maybe she really was out of her depth. Meanwhile, Ethan was battling his own storm. In his office high above the city, his PR team laid out newspapers, blogs, and clippings across the conference table. "This isn't sustainable," one advisor warned. "You've built an image of sophistication, exclusivity. This detour risks undermining it." "Detour," Ethan repeated, his voice cool. The advisor shifted uncomfortably. "With all due respect, Clara Bennett doesn't fit the brand. You've spent years cultivating a reputation, top models, elite events. A small-town secretary doesn't align with that image. Investors notice these things." Ethan looked down at the photo on the table. Clara's laugh had been genuine that night, uncalculated, unlike the rehearsed smiles surrounding them. He remembered the ease of her presence compared to the hollow perfection he was used to, but the weight of expectation pressed against him. Investors, shareholders, his own board. Every move he made became a headline, every choice scrutinized. To openly pursue Clara meant inviting more of this judgment, speculation, pressure she hadn't asked for. That night, Ethan stood at his penthouse window, gazing out at the glittering skyline. He thought of Clara in her navy dress, standing near the ballroom window, whispering that she didn't belong. She had been right. His world was ruthless. And yet, he couldn't shake the memory of her steady voice, her eyes meeting his without fear. The distance between them grew without either of them saying it aloud. Clara stopped expecting him to visit the store. She threw herself into work, determined to prove she wasn't some woman waiting to be rescued by wealth. But even as she stocked shelves or rang up customers, her thoughts drifted. She remembered the way Ethan had defended her against dismissive remarks, the way he had said, "You belong with me, not them." But did he really believe that, or had it just been words in the moment? Ethan, meanwhile, canceled his weekend plans to stop by the shop. He told himself it was to avoid drawing more attention, but the truth was harder to admit. He didn't know how to protect her from the storm his life created. Every instinct he had as a businessman screamed to manage, control, contain. But Clara was not a merger or a scandal to be spun. On Sunday evening, his phone buzzed with a message from an old acquaintance saw the magazine. "Since when do you trade runways for retail clerks?" Ethan deleted the message without replying, but the sting lingered. The following Monday, Clara was restocking pens when Ethan finally walked into the store. The bell jingled. She looked up, startled, her pulse quickening. "You shouldn't be here," she said before she could stop herself. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Why not?" "Because every time people talk. They're already talking enough." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Clara, let them talk. They don't matter." She shook her head. "Easy for you to say. You've lived in the spotlight for years. You know how to shrug it off. I don't. This isn't my world. Ethan, I don't want to be reduced to some headline." He reached out, then stopped, his hand hovering in the air. "I never wanted this for you, but I can't pretend I don't care." Clara looked at him, her chest tight. For a moment, she saw the man beneath the polish, the man who had wandered her aisles looking lost, who had laughed with genuine warmth. And yet, the gulf between them felt wider than ever. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. The silence stretched. Ethan's eyes searched hers, but she turned away, retreating behind the counter. The bell jingled again as another customer entered, breaking the fragile moment. Ethan lingered, but Clara had already slipped into her practiced routine, greeting the newcomer with a polite smile. For the first time since he had met her, Ethan left the store without a purchase, and Clara, watching him go from the corner of her eye, felt the sharp ache of something slipping away before it had even begun. The invitation came on a Wednesday afternoon, simple and direct. "Dinner. Tonight. Nothing fancy. Just us." Clara stared at the message on her phone during her lunch break, half a sandwich still in her hand. For days, she had kept Ethan at arm's length, careful not to get swept up in the whirlwind his presence created. But something about those 3 words, "just us," disarmed her. By 7 o'clock, She found herself walking down a narrow Boston side street she had never noticed before. The glow of a neon sign flickered above a small brick-front restaurant, its windows fogged with the warmth of cooking. Inside, tables were dressed with checkered cloths, candles burned in simple glass jars, and the air smelled of garlic, tomatoes, and fresh bread. It was no ballroom, no glittering gala, just a little trattoria tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. Ethan was waiting at a corner table, already out of place in his tailored jacket, though he had left his tie at home. When he saw her, his face softened, not the polished smile for cameras, but the quiet kind that seemed reserved only for her. "You came?" he said as he rose. Clara slipped into the chair opposite. "You weren't kidding. This is different." "Different good?" he asked. She looked around the mismatched chairs, the faded posters of Italian films on the walls, the older couple at the next table holding hands over their meal. "Different, real," she said. That seemed to please him. The waiter, clearly familiar with Ethan, greeted him warmly and spoke in quick Italian. Clara raised an eyebrow. "You speak Italian?" she asked once the waiter left. "Not fluently," Ethan admitted, "but Marco, the owner, used to cook for my family when I was in college. When my father was alive, he'd bring me here. It's one of the few places in this city that feels like home." There was a softness in his voice, a glimpse of something beneath the smooth confidence. Clara leaned forward slightly. "You don't talk about your family much." Ethan hesitated. Then, as steaming plates of pasta arrived, he began. "My parents died when I was 23, he said quietly. "Car accident, one phone call, and suddenly everything I thought I knew about my future was gone." Clara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I'm so sorry." "Ethan," he nodded, eyes fixed on the candle between them. "My father built coal innovations from nothing. Overnight. The company was mine. I hadn't finished grad school. I was supposed to be preparing for a job in finance, not sitting at a boardroom table with men twice my age, all waiting for me to tell them what to do." Clara could hear the weight in his words, the loneliness of carrying responsibility too soon. That must have been overwhelming. It was. Ethan admitted, "I learned fast. I had to. But somewhere along the way, I became the man they wanted me to be, confident, ruthless, untouchable. And the more I leaned into that role, the more I forgot who I was before." Clara watched him, seeing not the billionaire in the headlines, but the young man behind them, still haunted by loss. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. "That's a lot for anyone to carry alone." His gaze lifted to hers, gratitude flickering in his eyes. "And what about you? You've asked me plenty of questions, but I don't know much about your story." Clara leaned back, letting out a small laugh. "My story isn't magazine-worthy. I promise you that." "Doesn't mean it's not worth hearing," Ethan said gently. She hesitated, then spoke. "I wanted to go to college, English major, maybe even teaching. I love books, still do. But when my mom died, my dad needed help with the store. We couldn't afford tuition and keep the business running, so I stayed. I told myself I'd go back someday, but..." She shrugged. Life kept moving. Her voice caught for a moment, but she pressed on. "Sometimes I worry I missed my chance, that I'll spend the rest of my life scanning supplies and wondering what could have been." The confession hung between them, raw and unguarded. Ethan didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix it. He simply listened, and that alone felt like a balm. "Clara," he said after a moment, his voice steady, "you didn't miss your chance. You've been carrying more than your share, just like I did. That takes strength, and it doesn't mean your dreams are gone." She looked at him, surprised by the conviction in his tone. "You really believe that I do," he said firmly. "More than I've believed a lot of things in a long time." Something shifted then. A quiet recognition between two souls who had both lost something, who had both shouldered burdens too heavy for their years. Dinner stretched into hours, the conversation meandering between serious confessions and lighter laughter. They debated favorite books, compared terrible cooking experiments, and discovered they both secretly loved old black and white movies. For the first time since the headlines, Clara felt herself exhale. Here, in this little restaurant, away from the noise and judgment. They weren't a billionaire and a shopkeeper. They were just two people, bruised by life but not broken, finding common ground over pasta and candlelight. When they finally left, the night air was cool and fragrant with the faint smell of rain. Ethan walked her to her car, their steps slow, neither wanting the evening to end. At the door, he hesitated. "Clara," he began, his voice low. "Thank you. For tonight. For listening." She smiled softly. "Thank you for letting me in." For a moment, they stood close, the city quiet around them. Ethan lifted his hand, as if to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, but stopped himself. The space between them hummed with possibility, tender and unspoken. Then Clara whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe we're not so different after all." Ethan's breath caught. Maybe we're exactly what the other's been missing. But instead of leaning closer, they both stepped back, the moment fragile, unfinished. Clara opened her car door, her heart racing, and gave him one last glance before driving away. Ethan stood there long after the taillights disappeared, the echo of her words lingering in his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like Boston's untouchable entrepreneur. He felt like a man who had finally found someone who saw him, not the image, not the title, but him, and that realization terrified and exhilarated him all at once. The weeks that followed their dinner at the Trattoria unfolded like a string of small, quiet miracles. Instead of black-tie galas and glossy boardrooms, Ethan's world shifted into something simpler, something startlingly new. He met Clara at a corner cafe one Saturday morning, the kind with scuffed wooden tables and a chalkboard menu smudged with the day's specials. He ordered black coffee. She ordered a latte with cinnamon, and they sat by the window watching people hurry past with grocery bags and strollers. "This is your natural habitat," Clara teased, stirring her drink. Coffee without a crystal chandelier overhead. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. And yet, it tastes better here. He didn't mean the coffee. Later, they walked through the public garden, where children fed ducks at the pond and joggers weaved between benches. Ethan loosened his collar, his polished shoes crunching on gravel paths, and realized he hadn't felt this unguarded in years. Clara pointed out little details, the way the tulips leaned toward the sun, the rhythm of a street musician's guitar. She had a way of noticing things that grounded him, pulling him out of the endless calculations of profit and image. On another afternoon, she took him to a used bookstore tucked into a narrow alley. The place smelled of paper and dust, with shelves stacked so high they seemed to lean toward one another. Ethan trailed behind her, watching as she ran her fingers over worn spines like they were old friends. "You've read all these?" he asked, incredulous. "Not all," she admitted, "but enough to know each one has a story waiting for me." She pulled out a battered copy of The Great Gatsby and handed it to him. "Here, this one's about people chasing illusions of wealth. Maybe you'll find it relatable." Ethan laughed, but when he opened the book later that night, her words echoed louder than he expected. These little outings became their rhythm. Coffee shops, park benches, quiet bookstores, even a late-night hot dog stand after a movie. For Ethan, they were more than dates. They were lessons in living without performance. No cameras, no investors, no polished smiles. Just moments where he could be Ethan, the man who laughed too hard when mustard dripped on his sleeve, who let himself listen instead of constantly planning his next move. Clara noticed it too. One evening, as they sat on a park bench sharing ice cream, she studied him for a long moment before saying, "You look lighter these days." "Lighter," he echoed, amused. "Like you've put something down," she said softly. "Like you're finally breathing." Ethan was quiet for a while, staring at the swirl of chocolate and vanilla in his cup. Then he looked at her, honesty cutting through the layers of polish. "Maybe because with you, I don't have to be anyone but myself." Her heart gave a startled flutter at the admission, but she masked it with a playful grin. "Careful. You'll ruin your reputation as Boston's untouchable tycoon. Maybe it needs ruining, he said. The words lingered between them, heavier than either wanted to admit. For Clara, these days carried their own kind of transformation. She had expected to always feel overshadowed by Ethan's wealth, but in these ordinary places, she didn't feel like the secretary who caught a millionaire's eye. She felt like herself, a woman with opinions he valued, with stories he wanted to hear. Once, at the bookstore, he asked her which novel had shaped her most. She told him about reading Little Women as a teenager, how Joe's stubborn independence had made her believe she, too, could carve her own path. "Sounds like you," Ethan said. She blinked. "What do you mean?" "You stand your ground. You don't bend just because people expect you to. It's rare." The respect in his tone warmed her more than any compliment about her looks ever could, but the shadow of public scrutiny was never far. One morning, Clara arrived at the store to find a tabloid on the counter, left behind by a customer. The cover showed a grainy photo of her and Ethan walking out of the cafe, his hand brushing against hers. The headline screamed, "Billionaire's New Flame, Romance or Rebound." Her stomach dropped. By lunchtime, coworkers were whispering again. One even asked if she was auditioning for a reality show. Clara forced herself to smile, but inside she was shaken. That evening, she confronted Ethan as they strolled near the harbor. "This can't keep happening," she said, her voice tight. "Every coffee, every walk it turns into a headline. They twist it into something ugly." Ethan stopped, turning to face her. "I know, and I hate it, but I can't stop them. All I can do is choose what matters more, what they say, or what we have." Clara crossed her arms, her eyes on the dark water. "Easy for you to say. You've lived in this circus for years. I didn't sign up for it." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he said softly, "If you want to walk away, I'll understand." The honesty in his voice broke something inside her. She didn't want to walk away. She wanted these small moments, the bookstore laughter, the park bench confessions, the feeling of being seen, but the weight of the world around them pressed in, threatening to smother the fragile happiness they had found. That night, as Clara lay awake, she thought about the path her life had taken. For years, she had measured success in terms of survival, keeping the store afloat, paying bills, managing without complaint. She had never dared to imagine her life colliding with someone like Ethan Cole, and yet, in the quiet corners of Boston, they had built something that felt almost real. Almost. But as much as her heart longed to trust it, her mind whispered warnings. Ethan, too, stared at his ceiling that night, the skyline glittering beyond his windows. He replayed Clara's words, the fear in her voice, the doubt. For the first time in years, he had felt happiness not tied to money or power, and now, he realized, he might lose it because of the very world he had built. The magazine spread hit newsstands on a Tuesday morning. Ethan hadn't wanted to do it, but months earlier, before Clara, before any of this, he had signed the agreement. A glossy feature on the power players of Boston meant photo shoots, interviews, and at the editor's insistence, a tableau with high-fashion models posed around him like he was the center of their orbit. The images were everything the magazine wanted: sleek, glamorous, a billionaire framed by beauty and excess. But when Clara saw them, her chest clenched. The copy of the magazine lay open on the counter at Bennett's stationery, left behind by a customer. There was Ethan in a sharp suit, seated on a leather chair, 3 models draped around him. One leaned on his shoulder, another perched on the armrest, all long legs and perfect smiles. The headline read, "Ethan Cole, the man who has it all." Clara slammed the magazine shut, but the images burned in her mind. She tried to brush it off, tell herself it was business, just another piece of his carefully constructed world. Yet, deep down, the old fears whispered, "This is who he really is, and I'm just a passing distraction." That evening, when Ethan came by the shop just as she was closing, Clara couldn't hold it in. "You could have warned me," she said sharply, not bothering with a greeting. Ethan frowned, Clara. The magazine, she cut in. Did you think I wouldn't see it? You surrounded by women who look like they stepped off a runway. He exhaled slowly. It was arranged months ago. I didn't want to. But you did, Clara snapped. And now everyone else sees it too. The playboy billionaire, living the dream, and me. What am I supposed to be? A quirky side note. A story you'll laugh about one day, how you dated a small-town secretary for kicks. Her words struck him like blows. He stepped closer, but she backed away. Her arms crossed tightly. "Clara!" he said, his voice low, pained. "That's not what this is. That's not what you are to me." "Then what am I?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Because right now, it feels like I'm the only one who doesn't know." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering in his eyes. "You're the one person in my life who sees me. Not the image, not the headlines me. Do you think I'd risk everything if you were just a temporary distraction?" Clara's throat tightened. "But that's just it. Ethan, you have this whole other life. The world already decided who you are, what you represent, and I can't compete with that." He shook his head fiercely. "I don't want you to compete. I don't want models or photo shoots or the facade." I want his voice faltered, as if the words caught in his chest. "I want you." The sincerity in his tone was undeniable, but Clara's heart was already tangled in fear. Wanting isn't enough. Not when I'm the one who'll get crushed by all this. They stood in the half-lit store, the silence between them louder than the hum of the overhead lights. For Ethan, it felt like a negotiation where the stakes were higher than any deal he'd ever signed. And for Clara, it felt like standing on a ledge, terrified of the fall. "Finally," she whispered, "I can't be a headline. Ethan, I can't be your temporary story." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "If you can't show me that this is real, that I'm not just filling a gap until you move on, then maybe we should stop before it hurts even more." Ethan's chest ached as if the ground had shifted beneath him. He wanted to promise her forever, to erase every doubt with certainty. But the truth was, he didn't know how. He had spent so long being what the world demanded that he barely knew how to prove his heart was real. "Clara," he said hoarsely, "tell me what I can do. Anything. Just tell me how to make you believe." But she shook her head. "That's not something I can give you a checklist for. Either it's there, or it isn't." The finality in her tone cut deeper than any headline ever had. Ethan reached for her hand, desperate, but she pulled back. "I need space," she said, her voice trembling, "to think, to breathe." He nodded slowly, though every fiber of him rebelled. "If that's what you need." The bell above the door jingled as he left, the sound strangely hollow. Clara locked the door behind him, leaning against the counter, her chest heaving. For Ethan, the ride home was a blur of city lights and regret. He stared out the window of the car, thinking of her words, a temporary story. Was that all she saw when she looked at him? Was that all he had shown her in his penthouse? The magazine lay on the coffee table, mocking him with its glossy lies. He picked it up, stared at the image of himself flanked by women who meant nothing. And for the first time in years, he hated the man on the cover. He wanted to be the man Clara saw, the one who bought pens he didn't need, who laughed too hard at ice cream jokes, who found peace in a park bench conversation. But tonight, all she had seen was the mask, and he didn't know if he could convince her that the man beneath it was real. Ethan Cole was not a man who made reckless decisions. His career had been built on careful calculation, on knowing when to advance, when to retreat, when to gamble. But the morning after Clara's ultimatum, he walked into his office with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. His assistant handed him a stack of schedules, reminders for photo shoots, interviews, charity luncheons. He barely looked at them. Instead, he called his communications director into the boardroom. "We're canceling the campaign," Ethan said without preamble. The director blinked. "Canceling, sir? The magazine has already invested tens of thousands. The concept is approved. The model's booked. I don't care." Ethan interrupted. His voice was calm, but firm in a way that left no room for debate. That spread doesn't represent me anymore. I want a new concept. The director shifted, confused. What kind of concept? Ethan leaned back, folding his hands on the polished table. For once, he didn't see the city skyline or the empire he had built. He saw Clara's face in the dim light of the stationery store, her voice breaking as she told him she wouldn't be a headline. Authenticity, he said. We highlight the company's future, not my image. Sustainability projects, community investment, education initiatives, no models, no theatrics, just the truth about what matters. The director's eyes widened. That's unprecedented. Good, Ethan replied. It's time. By Friday. The announcement sent ripples through the business press. Ethan Cole pulls the plug on lavish campaign. Rebrands with humanitarian focus. Some praised him for courage. Others called it a calculated PR stunt. But the headlines kept coming. The billionaire who had once epitomized excess was now talking about renewable energy, employee wellness programs, and funding scholarships for underprivileged students. For the first time, the spotlight wasn't on the women around him or the parties he attended. It was on the values he was willing to stand for. And the world was watching. Clara read the news at the counter of the shop, her phone screen glowing under the fluorescent lights. She scrolled through articles, her mind a whirlwind. Ethan's quotes leapt off the page. Our company is more than numbers. It's about responsibility. We owe it to the communities we serve to invest in something that lasts. We've hidden behind glamour for too long. It's time to show who we really are. Clara set the phone down, her pulse racing. Part of her wanted to believe it that Ethan had truly chosen a different path, but another part whispered doubts. Was this change because of her? Because of their argument, her tears, her fears? Or had he reached this point on his own? The question unsettled her more than she cared to admit. That evening, Lisa the young cashier grinned as she showed Clara another headline. Your billionaire boyfriend's gone soft, Lisa teased. Saving the world instead of dating models. Guess you've tamed him. Clara forced a smile, but her stomach churned. The last thing she wanted was to be seen as some woman who had reformed a playboy. She didn't want credit. She wanted truth. But what if the truth was that Ethan had only done this for her? Meanwhile, Ethan sat alone in his office long after the staff had left, staring at the city lights. His phone sat untouched on the desk. He wanted to call Clara, to tell her everything, that it wasn't about saving face or about silencing headlines, that when he looked at the glossy photo of himself surrounded by strangers, he hated what he saw. He wanted her to know this wasn't a performance, but he also knew that words alone wouldn't convince her. Clara had lived her whole life grounding herself in reality. She didn't trust illusions. She didn't want promises. She wanted proof. And for the first time, Ethan wondered if proof might not be about grand gestures, but about the small, steady choices that followed. 2 days later, Clara found herself walking through the public garden again, trying to clear her thoughts. Couples strolled hand in hand. Families picnicked on the grass. The air was filled with laughter and the faint scent of lilacs. She thought of Ethan. Of the man who had once seemed larger than life, but who had sat across from her in a small trattoria, confessing the weight he carried. That man had been real. That man she could believe in. But could she believe in the billionaire the world saw? Her phone buzzed. A message. I'd like to see you. No pressure. Just coffee. Just us. Clara stared at it for a long time before slipping the phone back into her bag. Her heart wanted to run toward him, but her mind reminded her of the risks. Because if she let herself believe and he proved her wrong, she didn't know if she could recover. That night, Ethan stood on his balcony, the cool wind brushing against his face. For once, the city below didn't dazzle him. It looked distant, like a set piece in a play he no longer wanted to star in. He thought about Clara's words, a temporary story. Not anymore, he vowed silently. For years, he had been the man on the cover, the man with the polished mask. But if there was any chance left to prove himself to Clara, He would spend every ounce of his strength being something else, something real. The choice had already been made. Now he had to live it. Ethan didn't arrive in his Porsche this time. On Saturday afternoon, he borrowed an old pickup from the company garage plain, a little dented on the side, the kind of vehicle no one would associate with Boston's most photographed billionaire. He didn't wear a tailored suit either, just jeans, a gray sweater, and a look that carried more humility than Clara had ever seen on him. When she stepped out of Bennett's stationery, still wearing her work apron, she froze. Ethan leaned against the truck, hands in his pockets, as though he belonged on that quiet street. No cameras, no entourage, no performance. "Clara," he said softly when she approached. Her heart skipped despite herself. "What are you doing here?" He straightened, his gaze steady. "No headlines, no photo ops, just me. I was hoping you'd come for a walk." She hesitated, glancing down at her scuffed shoes, the faint ink stain on her hand from unpacking new pens. Everything about her life felt small compared to his. Yet his voice carried no trace of pressure, only a patience that unnerved her. Finally, she nodded, "All right, but just a walk." They drove in near silence, the hum of the old truck filling the space between them. Instead of the city, Ethan headed toward the coast. When they arrived, Clara stepped out onto damp sand, the salty air wrapping around her like an old blanket. The ocean stretched endlessly, restless waves rolling under a gray spring sky. For a moment, they simply walked, the crunch of shells underfoot, the cry of gulls overhead, the tang of seaweed in the air. The ordinary rhythm of the shore calmed them in a way no ballroom ever could. Ethan broke the silence first. "You were right, you know." Clara glanced at him, surprised. About what that magazine spread, about how hollow it all was. He kicked a small piece of driftwood as they walked. "When I saw myself in those pictures, I hated the man staring back at me. It wasn't me. Not anymore." Clara hugged her arms around herself. "But it's the version the world seems to want from you. I don't care what the world wants," he said firmly. "Not if it costs me the chance to be real." She stopped walking, turning to face him. The wind tossed a strand of her hair across her face, and she tucked it back with impatient fingers. "And what does real even mean for you? Ethan, a billionaire who decides to play ordinary for a season until it gets inconvenient." Her words were sharp, but beneath them lay raw fear. Ethan took a slow breath, letting her see the weight in his eyes. "It means showing up here, in this truck, with nothing to offer but honesty. It means admitting I don't have all the answers. And it means asking you to take this one step at a time with me. No promises of forever, no glossy covers. Just today, just us." The vulnerability in his voice disarmed her more than declarations of love ever could. She looked out at the sea, waves colliding against the rocks. "Do you know what scares me most?" she said quietly. "What? That our lives are planets on separate orbits, yours spinning in lights and boardrooms, mine in grocery lists and rent checks. Sooner or later, orbits drift apart." Ethan moved closer, careful not to close the space too quickly. "Or sometimes," he said gently, "they shift, and they meet." Clara shook her head, torn between hope and caution. "I can't be a project, Ethan, some experiment in living simply. I need to know that if I step into this, it's not just until something shinier comes along." Her voice trembled, the raw edge of someone who had lost before. Ethan's reply came without hesitation. "You're not a project. You're the one person who makes me feel alive in ways money never could. When I sit in boardrooms, I'm a machine. But when I walk into your shop and you hand me a pack of pens I don't need, I feel human. And I don't want to lose that." The sincerity in his tone made her throat tighten. They walked again. Slower now. Clara bent to pick up a smooth stone, tossing it into the surf. It skipped once before sinking. "One step at a time," she repeated softly, as though testing the words on her tongue. Ethan smiled faintly. "That's all I'm asking. They reached a weathered bench overlooking the water. Clara sat, pulling her knees close. Ethan sat beside her, leaving space, resisting the urge to close the gap too soon. For a long while, they just listened the rhythm of waves, the distant bark of a dog, the steady beat of their own hearts trying to find a shared cadence. Finally, Clara spoke again. "I don't know where this is going. Ethan, I'm still scared." "I know," he said, his voice low. "So am I." Her eyes widened. "You... Of course." He looked out over the gray horizon. "I've built empires, negotiated billion-dollar deals, but nothing terrifies me more than sitting here wondering if you'll let me try again. Because with you, Clara, there's no script, no safety net." Her lips parted, the honesty cutting through her defenses. She wanted to reply, to put her fears into words, but instead she let silence speak for her. Ethan didn't push. He simply let his hand rest lightly on the bench between them, close enough for her to bridge the distance if she chose. Minutes passed. The tide crept higher, and then, almost imperceptibly, Clara's hand slid across the wood and rested against his. Not a declaration, not a promise, just a step. And for Ethan, it was enough. The invitation had been sitting on Ethan's desk for weeks. A small charity fundraiser at a community center on the edge of town, not one of the glossy galas with champagne fountains and flashing cameras, but a modest evening meant to raise money for a local children's literacy program. It wasn't the sort of event Ethan usually attended, but when the reminder came, he saw it differently. Maybe this was a chance not to dazzle, but to simply stand beside Clara, to show her she wasn't a secret. So, on Saturday night, he pulled up outside her apartment in the same beat-up truck he had used on their walk by the sea. When Clara opened the door, wearing a simple navy dress and a cardigan, her first words were hesitant. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan nodded. "Only if you are." Her fingers tightened on her purse strap. "People will talk. They always do," he said gently. "Let them." The community center buzzed with energy when they arrived. Volunteers carried trays of cookies and paper cups of coffee. Children's drawings decorated the walls. The crowd was a mix of local teachers, librarians, and parents, ordinary people who had scraped together small donations because they believed in books and opportunity. But when Ethan Cole walked in, every head seemed to turn. Whispered voices floated through the room. "Is that him? Is that Ethan Cole? And who's she?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, every gaze like a weight pressing down. She tugged at her cardigan, wishing she had worn something else. Anything else. Ethan noticed. Without hesitation, he slipped his hand into hers. The gesture was simple, steady, but it anchored her. "Come on," he whispered. "Let's get some cookies before they're gone." She managed a small laugh, grateful for his attempt to ground her. During the evening, people drifted over, some cautiously polite, others curious, a few bold enough to probe. "So, Mr. Cole," a gray-haired librarian asked, balancing a plate of brownies, "what brings a man like you to a fundraiser like this?" Ethan smiled warmly. "The same reason as everyone else. Books change my life. If I can help another kid discover that same magic, it's worth showing up." The sincerity in his voice softened the librarian's expression. She turned to Clara. "And you, dear, how do you know Mr. Cole?" Clara's heart skipped. She could feel half the room listening. Ethan squeezed her hand gently, urging her to answer in her own way. Clara drew a breath. "He wandered into my shop one day looking for pens," she said with a small smile. "Didn't even know what kind he needed. I guess you could say we've been figuring things out ever since." A ripple of chuckles moved through the circle. Ethan grinned, clearly proud of her courage. Later, as the program director gave a short speech about the literacy fund, Clara stood at the back of the room, trying to process it all. The whispers, the stares, the unspoken judgments, they still weighed on her. But every time she faltered, she felt Ethan's presence at her side, solid and unwavering. When the speech ended, A young girl approached them shyly, clutching a worn library card. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice small. "Thank you for helping our reading club. We're going to get new books now." Ethan knelt so his eyes were level with hers. "You're the one doing the important work," he said softly. "Promise me you'll read every single one." The girl nodded, beaming, before darting back to her friends. Clara's throat tightened as she watched. This wasn't the Ethan from magazine covers or business reports. This was someone entirely different, someone who cared deeply, quietly, without expecting recognition. And he had chosen to stand here with her, in this modest hall, instead of hiding behind glittering walls of wealth. When they finally left, the cool night air was a relief. Clara leaned against the truck for a moment, exhaling as though she'd been holding her breath all evening. That was, she began, searching for the right word. Overwhelming, Ethan offered. She let out a shaky laugh. That's one way to put it. I felt like I was under a microscope the whole time. Ethan leaned on the truck beside her, his gaze gentle. "I know, and I can't promise the stares will stop. But I can promise you this: when people look, they'll see me standing next to you, every time." Clara's eyes stung. "That's a lot of pressure, Ethan. I know," he admitted, "but I also know you're stronger than you think, and I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, she searched his face, looking for cracks, for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was steady resolve. The tide of fear inside her shifted, replaced by something quieter, steadier. Not certainty, not yet, but the beginnings of trust. She reached for his hand again, not because she felt on display, but because she wanted to. And as they drove away from the community center, Clara realized that maybe this was what building a life together looked like, not in the glare of ballrooms or the scrutiny of tabloids, but in the courage to stand side by side when the world was watching. Ethan waited until the night was quiet, until the city outside his penthouse windows had settled into its softer rhythm of glowing lights and distant traffic. Clara sat curled on the couch, a mug of tea between her hands, her cardigan slipping off one shoulder. He watched her for a long moment before speaking. "There's something I've been working on," he began carefully, "and I want you to hear it from me before it shows up in the news." Clara looked up, wary. What kind of something? He sat beside her, setting a folder on the coffee table. Inside were legal documents, draft proposals, budgets, a foundation, he explained, dedicated to providing scholarships for students from low-income families, not just tuition living expenses, mentorship, the whole path, and it would carry your name. Her breath caught. "My name, the Clara Bennett Education Foundation," Ethan said softly. "Because it was your story, your sacrifices, your honesty that made me see how many doors are closed for kids who deserve a chance." Clara's chest tightened. She set her mug down with trembling hands. "Ethan, that's overwhelming, and I don't even know what to say." "Say whatever you feel," he urged. Her voice broke with uncertainty. "I feel like you're turning me into a symbol, a beautiful excuse for PR. People will say you're using me, or worse, that I'm letting myself be used." Ethan's expression hardened, not with anger at her, but at the truth she feared. "Clara, listen to me. This isn't about headlines. I don't care if my name is in bold print or not. What I care about is the kid who can't afford textbooks, the girl who gives up college because her dad passes away. Just like you did. That's who this is for." She swallowed hard. "But why attach my name? Why not keep it as your family's foundation?" "Because my family name already has a legacy," he replied. "Some of it noble, some of it tainted by excess. But your name, your story represents grit, resilience, and honesty. It's real, and that's what I want this to stand for." Clara rose from the couch, pacing, her emotions swirling. "Do you understand what you're asking? To have my name on something this big, reporters will dissect my life. They'll paint me as some Cinderella story, or as someone who latched onto you to get a spotlight. Either way, I lose." Ethan stood, meeting her eyes with a calm steadiness. Then, let me make one thing clear. You don't have to say yes. If it scares you, if it feels wrong, I'll take your name off and keep building it quietly. The foundation exists because the need exists, not because of branding. She stopped pacing, his words sinking in. You'd do it anyway, without attaching me. Of course, he spread his hands. This isn't about proving anything, not to the press, not to investors. It's about proving something to myself, that I can build more than profit margins, that I can honor what you've shown me about life outside these walls. Silence stretched between them, filled with the hum of the city below. Clara pressed her palm to her forehead, her thoughts a storm. She remembered nights as a teenager, working double shifts at a diner, wishing she could afford even one semester of college. She remembered watching her dreams slip away, feeling invisible. And now, here was Ethan, offering not just to restore that dream, but to multiply it for others. Her heart swelled with gratitude, and yet, the fear lingered. I don't want to be a story you tell to make yourself look good, she whispered. Ethan's reply was firm. Then don't be a story. Be a partner. She looked at him sharply. Partner? He nodded. Help shape it. Decide the mission, the programs, the selection process. If this foundation carries your name, it should carry your values, not as decoration, but as leadership. The sincerity in his voice startled her. This wasn't the Ethan from glossy spreads or polished speeches. This was a man inviting her into something that mattered. Still, doubt clung to her. And what if I fail? What if I'm not enough? Ethan stepped closer, his hand brushing hers gently. Clara, you've been enough since the day I walked into your shop and you told me I looked lost. You've guided me more than anyone else in my life. This foundation isn't proof of your worth, it's proof of mine. Proof that I finally understand what matters. Her throat ached with emotion. She wanted to believe, to throw herself into the vision, but the cautious part of her heart still whispered of traps and betrayals. I need time, she said finally, to think, to process. This isn't something I can agree to overnight. Ethan nodded, his expression tender. Take all the time you need. The paperwork can wait. What can't wait is the reality that kids are out there right now, working double shifts, shelving their dreams. That's what drives me, not the cameras. He gathered the folder, placed it back on the table, and didn't push further. Instead, he sat with her until the city lights dimmed and dawn began to paint the sky. And when Clara finally leaned her head against his shoulder, exhausted from the swirl of doubt and hope, Ethan didn't say another word. He knew that sometimes the truest proof wasn't found in speeches, it was found in patience. The decision had been simmering for weeks. Clara had carried it with her through long shifts at the shop, through quiet evenings when Ethan's hand rested warm in hers, through restless nights where old dreams resurfaced. Now, sitting at her small kitchen table, a resignation letter lay in front of her. One page, simple, final. Her pen hovered, trembling. What if I'm making a mistake, she thought? What if stepping away from what's safe leaves me with nothing? But then she remembered the foundation folder Ethan had shown her, the spark in his eyes when he spoke about giving students second chances. She remembered her own longing shelved for years, like dusty books. With a steady breath, she signed her name, Clara Bennett. When she told Ethan, it was on a quiet Sunday afternoon. They were walking along the Charles River, the sun low, painting the water in streaks of gold. I quit my job, Clara said suddenly, the words spilling out before fear could stop them. Ethan halted, his hand tightening around hers. What I handed in my notice yesterday. 2 weeks from now, I'm done at the shop. He searched her face, as if trying to gauge whether this was relief or recklessness. Clara, are you sure? She nodded, her voice firmer than she felt. I want to go back to school. Finish what I started. Education was always my dream. Before life interrupted. Ethan's first reaction was pride. It lit his chest like sunlight. But beneath it, a shadow stirred fear. If Clara stepped into a new world, one filled with lectures and classmates and possibilities, Would she drift away from him? Still, he swallowed his doubts. "Tell me what you need," he said quietly. Clara smiled faintly. "I don't need your money, Ethan. I just need your support." "You have it," he promised, though part of him wondered if support would be enough to keep her close. That evening, back at his apartment, Ethan poured them each a glass of wine. He watched her laugh at something small, her eyes crinkling, her shoulders relaxing. She looked lighter than he'd seen her in months, as though shedding the shop had lifted invisible chains. "Do you know what the best part is?" Clara asked. "What I finally feel like I'm choosing for myself. Not surviving, not adjusting, not just keeping the lights on. Choosing." Ethan reached across the table, brushing her hand. "That's what I love about you. You know who you are, even when life tries to bury it." But later, when Clara had fallen asleep on the couch, Ethan sat awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind whispered questions he couldn't voice aloud. What if she doesn't need me anymore? What if her freedom means leaving me behind? It wasn't jealousy. It was fear of irrelevance, fear of becoming just another chapter she'd outgrow. He closed his eyes and reminded himself love wasn't about holding on too tightly. It was about giving space to breathe. A week later, Clara packed up her things from the shop. She folded her apron one last time, tucked away her name tag, and handed the keys back to her boss. "You sure about this?" Clara, the woman, asked, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "You've been here a long time." Clara smiled softly. "That's exactly why I'm sure. It's time." As she walked out into the crisp air, she felt fear and exhilaration twined together in her chest. The city looked different, as though it held doors she had never noticed before. That night, she told Ethan about her enrollment confirmation. Classes would start in the fall, literature and education courses, the first steps toward becoming a teacher. He listened, his heart swelling with admiration. "You'll be incredible," he said. But when she caught the flicker of worry in his eyes, she tilted her head. "You're afraid." He didn't deny it. "I'm afraid of losing you to the life you've always deserved." Clara's voice softened. "Ethan, if this is love, then it has to make room for both of us to grow. If you want me to stay small just to fit your world, then it isn't love. But if you let me be free, if you walk with me instead of holding me back, that's real." Her words sank deep. He realized then that love wasn't measured in proximity or possession. It was measured in freedom. Weeks passed. Clara threw herself into preparing for school, browsing textbooks at used shops, sketching study schedules, even nervously considering dorm housing before deciding to keep her apartment. Ethan watched her blossom with every step, and though his fear still whispered, it was matched by a quiet pride. She wasn't becoming someone new. She was becoming more of herself. One evening, as they sat together on his balcony watching the city lights, Clara leaned against him. "Do you know what I've realized?" she asked. "What's that?" "That real love isn't about rescue. It's not about one person swooping in to fix the other. It's about being free to chase who you are, while knowing someone's in your corner, cheering you on." Ethan's throat tightened. "And you feel free with me?" She nodded, her hand slipping into his. "For the first time in my life." Ethan didn't reply right away. He just held her hand, the city stretching endlessly before them. Inside, his old fear still lingered, but slowly, steadily, it was being replaced by something stronger: trust. Trust that if he gave her wings, she might still choose to fly beside him. And for the first time, Ethan realized that maybe love wasn't about holding on at all. Maybe it was about letting go and finding each other anyway. The drive north was quiet. Ethan hadn't told Clara where they were going, only that she should dress warmly and trust him. She watched the road signs change from city streets to winding highways, then to narrow roads lined with pine trees. The air grew sharper, carrying the scent of salt long before the ocean came into view. When the truck finally pulled onto a gravel turnout, Clara saw the faint outline of the Atlantic. A thin mist hovered above the waves, and the horizon was just beginning to glow with the first strokes of dawn. Ethan cut the engine. "Come with me," he said softly. They walked down a sandy path to a stretch of beach nearly deserted at that early hour. The tide was low, the sand damp and firm beneath their shoes. The world felt stripped of noise, reduced to surf, gulls, and the whisper of wind. Clara wrapped her coat tighter, glancing at him. "Why here? Because it's simple," Ethan replied. "And everything important in my life seems to happen when things are simple." They walked in silence for a while, their footprints side by side, erased quickly by the tide. Clara could feel Ethan's tension, though he tried to mask it with calm. Finally, he stopped, turning to face her with the rising sun at his back. The light painted his features gold, softening the edges that the world usually saw as sharp. "Clara," he began, his voice steady but low. "I've spent most of my life trying to be who everyone expected me to be. The businessman, the image, the man on the magazine cover. But with you," he paused, his throat tightening. "With you, I'm just myself, and that's all I want to be." Clara's breath caught, the wind tugging at her hair. She sensed what was coming, and her heart began to pound. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, weathered box. Not velvet-lined, not flashy, just plain wood, as if it had been chosen for meaning rather than spectacle. He knelt on the damp sand, ignoring the cold that seeped into his jeans. Opening the box, he revealed a simple ring, a thin band of white gold with a single stone, modest and elegant. "I'm not going to promise forever," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because forever is too big, too abstract. What I can promise is this: to walk with you one day at a time, to wake up and choose you again and again, no matter what the world says." Clara's eyes blurred with tears. The sincerity of his words pierced through every layer of fear she had carried. Ethan's voice softened. "I don't want a perfect love story, Clara. I want a real one, with laughter, with doubts, with mornings when we burn the coffee and nights when we argue about nothing. I want all of it with you." He held out the ring, his hand trembling slightly. "Will you marry me? Not with grand promises of eternity, but with the promise of today and every tomorrow we're lucky enough to share." For a moment the world seemed suspended, the waves stilled, the gulls silenced, the horizon holding its breath. Clara pressed her hands to her mouth. Overwhelmed, she thought of the girl she used to be, shelving her dreams to survive. She thought of the man beside her, who had once been nothing more than a polished image. And she thought of the improbable, extraordinary path that had led them to this quiet strip of sand at sunrise. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. Ethan's shoulders sagged with relief, a laugh tangled with tears escaping him. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands clumsy but gentle. But the metal was cool against her skin, but the meaning burned warm. Clara pulled him up from the sand, and before words could clutter the moment, she kissed him. The taste of salt from the sea mingled with the salt of their tears. The world around them blurred, reduced to the warmth of his lips, the strength of his arms, the shared breath that promised a future neither of them had dared to imagine before. When they finally pulled apart, Clara rested her forehead against his. "One day at a time," she murmured. Ethan smiled, his eyes shining. "That's all we'll ever need." They walked back along the beach, hand in hand. The sun had risen higher now, casting long rays across the sand, turning the water into a sheet of gold. Clara looked down at the ring on her finger, simple and unassuming, yet heavy with meaning. She thought of the proposals she had seen in movies, grand gestures, extravagant promises, perfect lines delivered under twinkling lights. And yet, none of them could match the sincerity of a man kneeling on damp sand at dawn, offering not a fantasy, but a life lived honestly, step by step. For the first time, Clara realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of headlines, not of gossip, not of differences. Because love, real love, wasn't about erasing fear. It was about walking forward in spite of it. Ethan glanced at her, as if sensing her thoughts. "You know, I almost planned something bigger." He confessed, flowers, music, the whole spectacle. But then I realized that would have been for everyone else. This he gestured at the waves, the empty beach, the sun climbing higher. This is for us. Clara squeezed his hand. And it's perfect. As they climbed back into the truck, Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. The road ahead stretched unknown, uncertain, full of challenges. But for once, the uncertainty didn't scare her, because she wouldn't be walking it alone. The press release went out on a rainy Monday morning. It was short, direct, and unlike any corporate announcement Ethan Cole had approved before, the Clara Bennett Foundation for Educational Opportunity is officially established. Its mission to provide scholarships, mentorship, and resources for students from underprivileged backgrounds across New England. By noon, reporters were calling. Not because Ethan Cole had attached his name to another project he hadn't. His name appeared only once, listed as a co-founder. The spotlight, for the first time, was directed elsewhere. On Clara. The first public event was held in a modest lecture hall at a local university. Rows of students, teachers, and journalists filled the seats. Clara stood at the podium, her hands lightly gripping the wood, her heart pounding so loudly she thought the microphone might pick it up. She had rehearsed her speech 100 times, but when she looked out at the young faces in the crowd, hopeful, anxious, some carrying the same quiet desperation she had once carried, she put the paper aside. "I was 19 when I dropped out of college," she began, her voice steady though her palms were damp. "Not because I didn't want to be there, but because life didn't give me another choice. My dad passed away. Bills piled up, and I thought dreams were for people with better luck than me." A hush fell over the room. Clara continued, "But dreams don't have to end because circumstances get hard. That's why this foundation exists. Not to rescue anyone, not to make headlines, but to make sure that when you reach for opportunity, it doesn't slip through your fingers just because of money." When she finished, the applause rose like a wave. Clara blinked back tears, glancing at Ethan seated in the front row. He wasn't smiling for the cameras. He was smiling at her, only her. In the weeks that followed, the foundation became more than an idea. Offices were rented, applications opened, partnerships formed with universities. Clara threw herself into the works, interviewing potential board members, visiting schools, listening to student stories. For the first time, she wasn't someone's assistant, someone's girlfriend, or someone's afterthought. She was a leader. The media noticed. Articles described her as the woman redefining philanthropy and a voice for students who rarely get one. At first, Clara bristled at the attention, afraid it was just another angle of the fairy tale narrative she despised. But as she stood before students who hugged her after meetings, she realized the coverage didn't matter. What mattered was the lives being touched. And Ethan, he learned to step back. At board meetings, he listened instead of dominating. At press events, he stood slightly behind Clara, letting her words take center stage. It wasn't easy for a man used to controlling every narrative, but he discovered something new. Sharing the stage didn't diminish him. It freed him. One evening, after a long day of foundation planning, they sat together on Clara's apartment floor, surrounded by stacks of applications from hopeful students, papers spilled across the rug, handwritten essays mixed with typed resumes. Clara picked one up, her voice soft. "Listen to this. A boy from Worcester. Parents work 2 jobs each. He wants to be a teacher." Ethan leaned closer, reading over her shoulder. "That was you," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "And you, in a way, different struggles, same hunger." They sat in silence, absorbing the weight of it. Then Ethan spoke, his voice low. "Do you realize what we're building here, Clara? It's bigger than us, bigger than reputations or fears. It's legacy." Clara looked at him, her eyes shining. "Not your legacy, our legacy." But it wasn't all smooth. There were disagreements. Clara pushed for full scholarships, even when the budget strained. Ethan argued for phased expansion to avoid collapse. Sometimes voices rose, Frustrations flared. One night, after a particularly tense argument, Clara stood by the window, arms crossed. "You're still thinking like a businessman. Ethan, sometimes it's not about balance sheets. It's about faith." He pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling. "And sometimes faith has to meet reality. Clara, if we overextend too soon, we risk failing the very students we're trying to help." The silence between them was heavy. Finally, Clara turned, her expression softening. "Maybe we need both, your caution and my stubbornness. Maybe that's what will make this work." Ethan looked at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Maybe that's what will make us work too." Months later, the first cohort of scholarship students gathered in a small auditorium. Clara welcomed them personally, shaking each hand, listening to each dream. Ethan stood beside her, no longer as the billionaire benefactor, but as a partner in something real. As the students shared their stories, some trembling, some bold, Clara felt tears prick her eyes. This wasn't just about her past anymore. It was about their future. Afterward, as they walked out together, Ethan slipped his arm around her. "You realize," he said quietly, "this is only the beginning." Clara leaned into him, her voice certain. "And we'll build it one day at a time, just like us." Ethan kissed the top of her head, the simple gesture filled with all the promises he hadn't dared to make before. In that moment, under the soft glow of the streetlights, Clara understood something profound. Love wasn't just romance, or stolen kisses, or whispered confessions. It was this working through conflict, building together, daring to dream for others as much as for themselves. It was not a fairy tale. It was a shared future. The morning sun spilled through the blinds of Clara's small kitchen, painting golden stripes across the worn wooden table. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, rich and comforting, filling every corner of the modest apartment. Clara sat barefoot, her hair loosely tied back, cradling a mug between her palms. Across from her, Ethan leaned back in the chair, sleeves rolled up, his tie abandoned somewhere on the counter. He looked almost ordinary like this, no flashing cameras, no perfectly tailored suits, just a man in a kitchen, sipping coffee with the woman he loved. It was quiet, save for the hum of the old refrigerator and the faint rustle of the city waking outside. Clara broke the silence first, her lips curving into a thoughtful smile. "Do you remember the first time we met?" Ethan chuckled softly, setting his mug down. "How could I forget I was a billionaire who couldn't figure out how to buy printer paper?" She laughed, the sound light and warm. "You looked so lost, standing there in your three-piece suit, like the shelves were written in another language." He tilted his head, teasing. "And you, this quirky secretary with sharp eyes and sharper words, decided not to help me right away." "I did help," Clara countered, raising her brows playfully. "Just not in the way you expected. Someone had to knock that arrogance down a peg." Ethan's eyes softened, his voice lowering. "And thank God you did. I think you saw me that day in a way no one else had in years." Clara looked down at her coffee, letting the steam fog her vision for a moment. "Funny, isn't it? That's such a small detour, me covering the front desk. You wandering and confused ended up changing everything." Ethan reached across the table, his hand warm against hers. "Sometimes," he said gently, "the smallest detours lead us to the biggest destinations." They sat in a comfortable silence, memories threading between them like quiet music. Clara thought of the gala nights, the blinding flash of cameras, the suffocating whispers. She thought of their arguments raw, painful, necessary. She thought of the foundation, the students whose eyes lit with hope. But most of all, she thought of the ordinary things. Evening walks when Ethan carried her coffee, bookstore afternoons where they argued over Hemingway versus Fitzgerald, the nights spent sorting through scholarship essays on her living room floor. Those were the moments that truly built them, not the lavish dinners or the luxury trips, but the everyday gestures, the shared glances, the laughter in between chores, the quiet presence of someone who stayed. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You know," he said, his tone almost boyish, "I used to think happiness came in boardrooms and headlines, in proving myself, in winning. And now," Clara asked softly, "now I think happiness looks a lot like this kitchen," he admitted, simple, a little messy, but real. Clara's throat tightened. She reached across the table again, her fingers brushing his. "You've changed. Ethan Cole." He shook his head gently. "No, you helped me remember who I was before the noise." "That's different." Her chest swelled at his words. She knew he meant it. Every step they had taken, every fight, every tender moment had carved away the masks until only truth remained. The kettle whistled softly on the stove. Clara rose to refill their mugs, the simplest of domestic rituals. Ethan watched her move, a fond smile tugging at his lips. When she returned, placing his cup in front of him, he caught her wrist lightly. "Clara." She met his gaze. "I don't ever want to take this for granted," he said. "Not the coffee, not the mornings, not you, especially not you." Her eyes shimmered, but she forced a playful grin. "Then you'd better keep remembering how to buy office supplies, just in case." They both laughed, the sound mingling with the scent of coffee and the glow of morning. As the laughter faded, Clara leaned back in her chair, drawing in a deep breath. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what life would have been like if that day had never happened? If you hadn't walked into that store?" Ethan grew quiet, considering. Then he shook his head. "No, because I think I was always meant to walk in. Maybe not that exact day, maybe not that exact aisle, but somehow, some way, I would have found you." Clara smiled faintly. "Destiny. Huh. Coming from the man who doesn't believe in fate." He grinned. "I don't believe in fate. I believe in choices. And meeting you was the best accident I ever chose to hold on to." Her heart fluttered, the warmth of his words settling deep within her. The clock ticked softly on the wall. The world outside bustled, but inside that kitchen, time seemed suspended. Clara set her mug down, her eyes lingering on Ethan. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "love stories always make it seem like grand gestures are what matter. But this is what I'll remember. Sitting here, talking, laughing, just being." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "And that," he whispered, "is exactly why I love you." The morning stretched on, unhurried. They finished their coffee, talked about groceries, about the foundation's next steps, about the little trip they wanted to take that summer. Ordinary things. Beautiful things. As Clara cleared the mugs, she paused by the sink, looking back at Ethan with a gentle smile. "Sometimes," she repeated softly, "the smallest detours lead us to the biggest destinations." Ethan rose, crossing the kitchen to wrap his arms around her from behind. He rested his chin on her shoulder, their reflection faint in the window above the sink. "And I wouldn't trade ours for anything," he said. Clara leaned into him, her eyes closing as the warmth of his embrace wrapped around her. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but theirs, and that was enough. At its heart, Ethan and Clara's story reminds us of something we often forget. True love and true fulfillment are rarely found in wealth, status, or appearances. They live instead in the quiet moments, the morning coffee shared in a small kitchen, the laughter during a walk in the park, the courage to be honest when it's easier to hide. Ethan learned that success without authenticity is a hollow victory, and Clara discovered that real love does not demand she shrink herself, but invites her to grow. Together, they show us that partnership is not about rescuing or being rescued, but about building something meaningful side by side. For those of us who have lived long enough to know how fragile life can be, their journey is a gentle reminder it's never too late to start again, to risk vulnerability, and to choose presence over perfection. Sometimes the greatest transformations happen not in grand gestures, but in the smallest detours, a chance meeting, a kind word, a laugh that feels like home, and perhaps that is where life's deepest blessings quietly wait for us. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and sharing in this story. If it touched your heart, made you smile, or reminded you of life's quiet blessings, we'd love for you to stay connected with our community. Please remember to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next inspiring story. Your support helps us keep bringing these moments of hope and reflection to life. Until next time, may your own journey be filled with love, laughter, and meaningful detours.